Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the 6th round of the Global Chess League, which is being held here in London. Now, the first half of the event is over, and one player in particular is standing out, and that would be the Iranian player ALIREZA Firouzja, who is now representing France. ALIREZA has been on an incredible run. After drawing in the first round against Anish Giri, he has beaten Magnus Carlsen, myself, Vishy Anand, and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave to finish the first half with 4.5 points out of 5 and on a 4-game winning streak. So we head into the second half of the tournament. Everybody's to play each other once again, but with the colors reversed. And will we see ALIREZA become the 5-time by winning his 5th game in a row, or will Maxime finally stop him? All right, so Maxime has the white pieces, and the game starts out with e4. We get c5, knight f3, d6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, and a6. Now, this, of course, is the classic Najdorf variation of the Sicilian. ALIREZA has been offering to go into this in previous games, including against myself, and we finally get to see him in this variation. Now, it's worth pointing out that Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, his opponent, has actually played the Najdorf from the black side for his entire career, so he should be very much at home with both colors. So Maxime plays the move bishop c4. Now, this is what is known as the Sozin variation, where white puts his bishop on c4 to put pressure on this diagonal. Now, it was a favorite line of the former first American world champion, Bobby Fischer. So we get e6 played here. Now Maxime plays bishop e3. We get b5, bishop b3. We have bishop e7. And now Maxime plays move a3. Now, the idea behind a3 is that you try to stop black from pushing b4 here. If you were to play a move like, I don't know, let's just say h3, after b4, knight e2, knight takes e4, black would have an extra pawn in the center of the board. So we get a3 to stop b4. I will point out that there are some nuances to these positions in case you're wondering why ALIREZA did not play the move b4 right away, but we're not doing an opening course video at the moment. So we get this position after a3. Now ALIREZA castles, and Maxime plays the move queen e2. Now, white has a lot of flexibility here. White can try to castle the king to the king side or go to the queen side. It's really anybody's call on which way white will go. So we get the move bishop b7. Here Maxime plays move f3, guarding this pawn on e4, and now we get the move knight c6. Now, in this position, Maxime decides to be ultra aggressive and castle to the queen side. He could, of course, castle to the king side as well, but now it's very much a positional game, and it's going to lead to who places their pieces better in the middle of the board. So Maxime instead castles queenside, and now it's all in here. White wants to attack on the king side here, and black wants to try to attack on the queen side. So whose attack is going to be quicker? So ALIREZA goes knight a5 here, and now we get to move king to b1. Now, this is a moment where white probably should have played g4 or h4, trying to attack right away. King b1 is not necessarily a bad move, but it is a little bit slow. ALIREZA goes rook to c8, and now we get this move queen to e1. This is a very, very critical moment here where rook c8 is actually a mistake, because the computer says that white should sack the knight on the e6 square here, and after takes, now the king is in check, and after king to h8, white can take, and after queen c8 and a move like bishop c1 here, apparently after knight c4, for example, white can go b3, and with white pushing all these pawns on the king side here, white is actually quite a bit better. Now, do I fault Maxime for not finding this? Not at all, because first of all, it's a rapid game, but secondly, it's not so clear that white is much better. I will, however, point out that this is one of the things that I remember learning around 2009 or 2010 from computers, which is that in many cases, computers actually favor a rook and a couple of pawns in return for a bishop and a knight, whereas we as humans, we generally tend to think a bishop and a knight are worth more than a rook and a couple of pawns in this situation. So it is important to note that, once again, computers do like a rook and pawns versus a bishop and knight, but it is, of course, flexible in terms of how it works. Instead, we get the move queen to e1 here from Maxime. Now, probably Maxime's reasoning behind this move is that if he were to play a move like h4, black has a very thematic sacrifice. You can sack the rook takes knight, and after takes and d5 here with these weak pawns on the queen side, knight coming to c4 potentially, black is quite a bit better. So we get queen e1 instead, Maxime trying to prevent the rook sack, but also keep the ideas of knight takes e6 alive as well. ALIREZA goes knight d7, and now we get this move h4. Maxime is simply trying to push his p up the board on the king side. We get the move knight to e5, and now Maxime goes h5, and here we get the move knight c4. Now, this has shades of a lot of similar positions and mentions we've made in the past, where if you get a knight to f5 or f4, it's very strong. Now, with white having castles to queen side, in this case, it's getting a knight to c4. Now, the famous former world champion, Garry Kasparov, made the statement that knight on f5 or f4, or in this case c4, is worth at least one juicer. So after knight c4, we get the move bishop c1, Firouzja goes bishop f6, and now we get the move g4. After g4, we get the move queen b6, and ALIREZA is trying to put pressure on all the diagonals here towards the white king, but also maybe go b4 and attack on the b file as well. With all of black's pieces massing near the white king with these knights, the queen, the bishop, it's already looking very dangerous, and on top of that, keep in mind this is a rapid game. So as time gets lower, the player who has an easier plan, or in this case, the attacking plan that ALIREZA has, it should favor him just a little bit. So we get knight c to e2, and now we have the move d5 played, a very thematic move from ALIREZA trying to activate the last piece here. You can look at this position, and if you look at the harmony of it, the knights are very well placed on the queen side. Bishop on f6, nice diagonal, queen, nice square, rook on the c file. Other than this bishop, or perhaps having a rook on d8 here, you pretty much have achieved the perfect placement of your pieces. So when ALIREZA goes d5, now he wants to open up the diagonal, and if he can get both of these bishops to be active here, it's going to be a world of hurt for Maxime. So Maxime plays g5. We get to move bishop to e7 here, and now we have pawn takes pawn, and we get bishop takes d5. Now the computer actually here wants to move bishop takes d4 instead. Again, not a very human move in my opinion, because when you do this, now it looks like white is attacking on the king side, and where exactly is your attack towards the white king on b1? So we get bishop e7. We get pawn takes pawn, bishop takes, and now Maxime plays knight f4, and suddenly these knights on d4 and f4 are very active and hitting black's central pawns and bishops as well. So here ALIREZA plays move bishop b7, and now we get to move g6, and just like that, Maxime has turned the tables completely. He is now attacking on the king side very quickly with these knights hitting the pawn on e6 here. Black is actually in a lot of trouble. So ALIREZA goes bishop f6 here, trying to put the bishop back on this diagonal and also anchor this pawn on g7 as well. Maxime takes on f7, and this is a huge mistake here. Now, what Maxime should have played here was a move h6, simply sacking the house. You're probably thinking, wait, you hang the knight on d4, what are you doing? But after bishop takes d4, now white can take the pawn on g7, and suddenly you're getting massacred on the g and the h files here. A sample line is a move like king takes g7 here, and now after rook takes h7, king g8, white can go queen g3, and suddenly there are all kinds of mating threats. Say you play a move like, I don't know, knight takes b3 to illustrate the point. I take the pawn, checking the king, only moves to take the rook, and now I have rook to h1, checkmating the king with the classic ladder on the h file. So after h6, this is actually completely winning for Maxime if he were to play it. The best line according to the computer is to play something like f takes g6, hg7, and rook fd8. But now after bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, and queen g3, apparently white is still crashing through on the king side here. Is this obvious? No, not at all. Not in any shape or form. But it's worth pointing out that after, say, rook d4 and queen h3, suddenly everything's under attack and white is completely winning. Now, in a classical game, I think there's a good chance Maxime would find this, but the problem with Rapid and Blitz, especially with no increment, is you have to make decisions. Now, when you have to make these decisions, you sort of have to have an internal clock or a cutoff where you stop thinking, and Maxime ends up playing the move g takes f7. Now, he does play this move, in my opinion, way too quickly here. I think he should have used maybe 4 or 5 minutes and trusted his instinct. I will give you an example of a situation where a player did trust his instinct, and that was in the game between ALIREZA and Vishy Anand earlier in the tournament, where at a critical moment, ALIREZA used 8 minutes before playing his move, and that showed a great amount of confidence in believing that ALIREZA, even if he got low on time, could still find the best moves. And this is a situation where Maxime really needed to sense the moment and use his time, but instead he plays the move pawn takes pawn. Now after rook takes pawn, you'll notice that white no longer has an attack towards the black king. The king is very, very safe here, and suddenly all of these diagonals are open. Your knights are optimally placed, and white is actually simply much worse, if not close to losing. So Maxime plays knight f takes e6. ALIREZA goes rook to e8 here, pinning the tail on the donkey. Now the knights are in trouble. There are problems on all the diagonals. The knights are good. The rook on e8 hits knight on e6. And just like that, Maxime's hopes are gone. So he plays queen g3. ALIREZA sacks the rook, and this is actually a mistake here. Computer wants to move bishop to c8 here, going after the knights again, and white is in all kinds of trouble. Instead, we get rook e6. Maxime takes, we get takes, and now we have the move rook he1. Now we've had an imbalance where black now has these knights in return for the tower, but because white has the towers on the 2 open lanes here, the E and the D files here, white actually is very much in the game. So we get the move queen c8. Maxime plays move bishop a2, and now we get the move h6. Now the reason that Maxime plays bishop a2 here is he simply wants to keep this bishop alive. He wants both of the bishops in play here, and it's just a nice Nice. What's the move? Word I'm thinking of? Prophylactic move. So we got bishop a2. ALIREZA goes to h6 here, and now we get the move rook to d3. Knight c6 is played, and here Maxime plays move f4, and this is a mistake. Now the computer actually wants to move bishop takes h6, and the reason probably that Maxime didn't play this is he probably thought maybe there's bishop b2 here. Now the protection from the king isn't there, and you're in trouble. But after this great move rook to e3 with the two b's on the diagonals, all the play on the e file, white is apparently much better in this position. Now, do I think this is realistic? No, this is absolutely 3,500 level computer chess. In a classical game, maybe some of these moves could occur. Even then, I think you get mistakes. But in a blitz game and a rapid game, players getting long time, just no way in a million years you see these 3,500 level variations. So we get the move f4 instead here from Maxime. He's trying to take away the e5 square from D's knights here, and now we get the move knight e7. Now the problem with f4 from white's vantage point is now there are no longer any threats on this diagonal because you put the pawn in the way of the b, and now if black maneuvers his pieces correctly here, it's going to be a lot easier to play. So Maxime goes rook d1, we get queen to f5 here, a nice move going after this weak pawn on h5, and now you're not really worried about rook d8 because you can simply slide the king to h7. So we get rook d8, king h7, Maxime plays rook b8, and now we get another nice move, bishop to e4. Now probably what Maxime was thinking was that if you play a move like bishop c6, for example, suddenly you have rook d to d8, you've created the double stack on the 8th rank, and if black plays a move like a5, uh-oh, spaghetti-o, it's rook h8, checkmate. However, even in this situation, black can go g6, and the bishop simply covers the square on h8. So after rook b8, we get bishop e4. Maxime plays bishop b3 here, trying to guard the pawn on c2 before infiltrating with the double stack on the 8th rank. We get to move knight to c6 here, and now at this point, rook e8 is played. Now, after knight c6, all of white's dreams and hopes of creating the double stack no longer exist, as the bishop and the horse cover the critical square. So we get rook e8. ALIREZA plays knight d4, and this is simply the game-winning move here, because now at D's knights and D's bishops, all of black's pieces have perfect harmony here, and as long as there's no checkmate with a move like queen g6, the game is over. Maxime plays king a2 here. Now we get knight takes bishop, pawn takes, and here we have the move bishop b1 check being played. Maxime goes to a1, and now we get another nasty move, knight takes a3 here, because with the bishop and the queen on the diagonal, white has no threats like queen g6 here. You take, and you win the game. And without ideas like queen g6 and no rook d8 either, because the bishop covers the d8 square, it is all but hopeless. Maxime plays move queen f3, we get b4 here, and now after rook d2, we get the nasty move knight to c2. Important move, by the way. If you were to go knight c2 right away, just to point this out, after king takes b1, you're still winning with a move like knight e3 maybe, but if you go knight a3, now after king to a2, if you play queen b1, I can eat the juicer on a3. So when we get the position after b4, rook d2, knight c2, now if you take the bishop, I create the double check with knight a3, hitting the king both ways. And when you go up, queen b1 is checkmate because the pawn holds the horse on a3. So after knight c2, Maxime sacks the rook, but after bishop takes c2, he resigns the game because now after queen to a8, trying to mate on h8 once again, there's queen to a5, checkmating this king in the corner. So a very, very impressive game here from ALIREZA. He wins his 5th game in a row, and he moves to 5.5 points out of 6. ALIREZA is simply torching everyone in this event, and it's probably a bit of a shame for him that this is a rapid event versus classical, but nonetheless, he is playing out of his mind and destroying everybody. So, big one for ALIREZA. He moves to 5.5 points out of 6, 5.5 out of 6 in this event. And we're going to move on to another game being played today between two of the players on the icon boards. Now, this game features the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen, who I played yesterday, facing off against Anish Giri from the Netherlands. Now, Anish has had a rough go of it lately. He's dropped some rating points. He is somewhere around top 20 in the world now, but he is a perennial player who usually is near the top. So Magnus with the white pieces, he opens with d4. We get d5 being played here. And now after d5, we have the move c4. Now we get e6, knight f3, knight f6, and Magnus goes g3, playing the classic Catalan system, intending to fianchetto the bishop to g2. Now we're going to do a slight station break here. I'm going to tell you guys that a lot of the memes, a lot of the words that I say, I have noticed that people sometimes get angry about my pronunciations. Now, of course, like any normal person, I do speak some Italiano, and I know that, of course, it's pronounced fianchetto. But a lot of the rise of chess and the memes and everything that have made it so popular over the last couple of years are around mispronunciations and having fun with the game of chess. So no offense to those of you guys who are Italian watching these videos, but we're going to keep on calling it the fianchetto in honor of XQC, who's one of the godfathers that started the whole chess boom back in 2020. So we get g3. On each goes bishop b4, we get bishop d2, bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, castles, and now we have the move c6 being played. Magnus goes queen c2, we get knight d7, a4, a5, and now we have the move rook c1. Here on each plays move h6, and we get this move e3, and now rook e8 is played. Now this position is very, very flexible for both sides. Magnus has the idea of putting the knight on a3 or c3, maybe even d2 later on. Black still has the option of taking on c4 or playing for c5, e5, even b6 and bishop b7 or bishop a6 is also in play as well. So we get bishop e1 here, we have bishop d6, and now Magnus plays knight bd2, developing the knight this way and intending to potentially play e4. Also keep in mind the bishop on e1 might look passive, but in the long run, it will potentially target the pawn on a5. So we get e5, takes, 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 and now we have knight to f3 being played. Now at this point, white is a little bit better due to this isolated pawn on d5, or as they would say in Italiano, the isolani pawn, which is a little bit weak. We get bishop d6, bishop c3 is played, and after knight e4 and rook d1, Magnus looks to be in the driver's seat as he's pressuring this weak pawn on d5. On each plays bishop e6, and now we get the move knight to d4, and here we have the move bishop g4 being played. Magnus goes rook to d3 here, not f3 by the way. You might be thinking this is a fork of the horse and the b, but black can take the bishop, and after queen c3 and let's say bishop h5 for example, you have a slight weakness on e3 which now offsets the weak pawn on d5. So we get rook d3. On each plays bishop to f8, and now we get the move h3, and here bishop h5 is played by Anish. Magnus goes knight to e2 with the idea of rerouting the horse to f4 and hitting the pawn and the bishop at the same time. Anish goes knight takes knight, and here we get the very enterprising move pawn takes pawn. Now when Magnus played this move knight to e2, no doubt he saw the upcoming sack the rook meme, and he expected it to happen. So we get takes, takes, bishop g6, and you're thinking, oh man, Magnus has blundered the rook. Probably in reality, Magnus in mind was thinking about all the memes with sacking the rook, maybe thinking about a Levy video, something like that, and he decides to go for it with knight f4. We get takes, takes. Now at this point, white is temporarily down a rook for a knight, but white is going to win this pawn on d5 and create a classic wooden shield in the future. So here we got the move rook c8, rook b1, b6, h4, and Magnus here is trying to delay the capture of the pawn. We get bishop c5, and now after takes and rook c7 here, white has a great wooden shield in the middle of the board. He also has a bit of a bastion on f4 as well, so white should be a little bit better. We get the move h5, queen g5, king g2, and now Anish plays move rook e7, and Magnus plays rook e1. Now, if Magnus were to play a move like rook b3, potentially there's a sack here. I think you sack the bishop, not the rook. You sack the bishop, and after takes, takes, suddenly there are all kinds of threats towards the pawn on g3 and the king on g2. Of course, it is also a classic 90-degree right triangle. So we get rook e1 to prevent the sacrifice from Magnus, and now Anish plays move rook e5. Now after rook to e5 is played, Magnus plays c4 to reinforce the b here, and you'll notice the knight guards the pawn and the bishop, and white has a pleasant advantage. Now is it enough to win? Hard to judge, because at the same time, the queen side is completely locked. The bishop and the pawns all guard each other very nicely. White can't really push any of the pawns, so it's all going to come down to the center of the board and whether Magnus can start to push p to try and push the black rooks backwards. So we got the move queen f5, Magnus goes queen d1, we get rook e7, queen f3, king h8, and now we have the move e4. Now Magnus clearly understanding the positional ideas here, trying to push p here. If he can get it, he would love to push this pawn all the way to e6, so that black has to make a decision with the pawn, and if you push, there's knight g6 here, a classic bastion, forking the king and the rook, and if black takes, the same issue, and really if this pawn ever goes, the g6 square is free for the horse, and white will win the game. So we get queen to e5. Here, Magnus decides to play bishop takes f7, and this is a very interesting moment in the game. Now, the computer actually likes queen c8 more, but I suspect that the computer misses the idea that Anish has here when he plays queen to e5, because no doubt it doesn't believe in fortresses. So we get bishop takes pawn, sacking the bishop, and intending to fork the king and the queen with knight g6. Anish takes, we get knight g6, king g8, knight takes e5, and now you're thinking, well, it's game over. Rook takes f3, knight takes f3. White has two extra pawns. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, two extra pawns, endgame easy peasy for Magnus Carlsen. However, Anish has another idea, which is he's going to sack the queen, and now black has a rook and a bishop in return for the queen, and in fact, it's quite hard for white to even prove an advantage. We get queen d1, rook takes f2, king to h3, and now we have the move king h7. Now the reason it's hard to prove an advantage here is that black is blockading this e-pawn, which would like to go up the board, and because this pawn is on e4, it actually stops white from ever being able to attack on a diagonal. Say you get a position like, I guess it's let's say, I'm just going to set this up something like this where the rook is back one square. Now white can start to use the diagonals, you can use the open file, and you can try to push p up the board with e6 down the road as well. So because the rook is on e5 blockading this pawn here, it's very difficult for white to do anything without access to multiple diagonals. Of course you have the open file here, but your pawn on h5 is also a little bit weak. So at this point it's looking very difficult for Magnus to win the game. Additionally, this is very close to being a classic fortress, which, as I mentioned in yesterday's video, Magnus Carlsen, the world champion or former world champion, does not believe in fortresses, but sometimes they occur anyway. So Magnus goes g4 here, trying to guard the pawn on h5, and Anish plays the move king h8. We get queen d8, rook f8, queen d3, and now Anish plays the move rook f4. Now what Anish is doing is stabilizing the rooks here. They're big blockades with the rooks on e5 and f4, and this bishop on c5, very, very well placed, as white can't do anything on the queen side. So ultimately it comes down to whether white can push p in the center with the e-pawn or utilize the open d file here. Magnus plays king g3, we get rook f6, rook d1, and now we get the move rook d6. Another excellent move here from Anish, or so you would think. Apparently computer doesn't like it. I don't know why. It looks correct to me. Apparently rook to e8 with rook e6 is supposed to be a little bit better, because after rook d6 and queen to c2, now white's advantage is gone. Apparently Magnus is supposed to go here, because after rook to f6, now you can check, and I guess you have queen e3 and there's some kind of infiltration on the queen side. Now, keep in mind that here Magnus is lower on the clock. He's down 2 minutes here, no increment, and after his nightmare loss against ALIREZA, he's probably trying to play quickly, and I can speak from my personal experience in this event, that as the time starts ticking, you start getting worried. You can sense the time pressure coming, and you want to move quickly. That being said, Magnus probably still had a good chance to find this move, but instead he goes to c2. Now the reason this is a mistake is because now black can sack the rook with rook takes e4, and the advantage is gone completely. The reason the advantage is gone completely, as I'll illustrate why, if you trade the rooks, you're probably thinking, well, just take the rook. Unfortunately, now your king is in check here on g3, and if you take this tower like in the game, now black takes this one, whereas if the queen were on f3 here and you play rook to e4, now white can check on f8, and after king h7, many ways to win, but simplest is to take the rook, and after takes, you simply have a queen versus a rook, and there is no fortress, and black will resign. So Anish spots rook takes e4, Magnus plays the move queen takes rook, and now after rook takes d1, the position is actually drawn because the bishop and the pawns hold each other on the queen side. This means white can never do anything over here, and now we have the same number of pawns on the king side, and because they're symmetrical, G and H file is just a draw. We get queen e8, king h7, queen e6, rook d6, check, king h8, and now Anish has many ways to draw. You can stabilize with rook f6, d6, rook d4, d6. Basically, you just don't do anything on the queen side. You leave the bishop and the pawns here, and you just shuffle the rook and do the classic dance. We get king f3, check, king e2, rook d6, and here Magnus Carlsen agrees to a draw because there's simply nothing he can do. Even if he were able to get a specific position like this where he can push g5, black can still keep shuffling the rook between d6 and f6 here, and white can never make any progress. So this game ends in a draw. Definitely a disappointing result for Magnus to draw this game because he was trying to win and he was better at some moments, but Anish shows that fortresses do exist in the game of chess, and he stays true to his name of being Drawnish Giri. Alright, so Anish draws against Magnus. Now the last game we're going to take a look at is of course the game featuring myself against Vishy Anand, the 5-time world champion from India. Now yesterday I beat Vishy in a very nice game with the white pieces, and today we're back at it and I'm playing with the black pieces. So Vishy opens with e4, I go c5, knight f3, and now I play the move g6, just like I did against the other 5-time world champion in this event, Magnus Carlsen, in last night's evening round. We get c3 here from Vishy, and now I play d5. We had e5, bishop g4, bishop b5, and now the move knight c6. Now I actually had this position in the candidates against the current contender for the world championship, D. Gukesh from India, so I was pretty familiar with this position. Vishy castles, I go rook c8, and now we get the move d4. Now, I believe in my game against Gukesh, I think he took on c6, and then we had this move castles, and I think I played c4 if I remember it correctly. So in this game, we get castles, I play rook c8, Vishy goes d4, takes, queen to b6 here, and what I'm trying to do is put pressure on this d4 pawn immediately. absolutely immediately, when you combine the pressure with this bishop on this diagonal, it could get scary for white if he's not very careful. Vishy takes, I take, and now he goes knight bd2. Now, the reason that Vishy puts the knight on d2 is he wants to be able to recapture with the horse here. Specifically, if you play a move like knight c3 after e6, let's just say bishop e3, knight to e7, for example, h3, takes, and knight f5, you'll notice that there's a lot of pressure on this pawn on d4 here, as well as pressure on the b and c files, and white's pieces are not optimally placed. So when Vishy goes knight d2, what he wants to do is get this specific position where the knight guards the pawn, and now after, say, knight e7, white can go bishop g5, for example, maybe even bishop d2 with a bishop c3 idea, and you'll notice that this pawn on d4 is much better here with the knight guarding it and aiming towards the king side than with a knight on c3. So Vishy goes knight d2, and now I play this move bishop to f5. I decide I'm not going to trade the bishop for the knight, because now that white has not put the knight on c3, I'm going to argue that I have plenty of time to just develop and keep the two b's alive. So Vishy plays the move rook to e1, and now I go for this move bishop c2. We get queen e2, and here I spend actually, sorry, not this move. I spent a bit of time here before playing bishop c2 and queen to a6. At the end of the day, the reason I played this was I thought that with the two b's on the board and queens coming off in the long term, I should be better. Computer, however, prefers to move e6, and after knight to f1, something like h6 followed by knight e7 and knight f5, and black is completely fine. Also worth pointing out that if white were to play bishop e3, black can now go queen a6, and after takes, with the knight being on f1 and f3 here, there is going to be a very significant difference versus the game, as we'll see in a moment. So I go queen a6 right away, Vishy trades, and now he goes rook to e3. Vishy's idea here is to play rook to c3. If I play bishop g7, rook c3, for example, suddenly there's pressure on the bishop. If I go back to f5, I believe there's knight b3 with knight c5 here, forking the pawn on the rook. There's also rook c7, creating the kebab on the 7th rank, and it could get scary in a hurry. So I play rook c6 to stop rook c3. Vishy plays rook a3. I go a6. And now he finds the best move in the position, knight to b3, aiming for either knight to a5 or knight to c5 to pressure these pawns on b7 and a6. Here I go e6, Vishy plays knight c5, and now I spend almost 3 minutes before playing this move bishop d1. Now bishop d1 is a mistake, but this is one of those situations where it's very tough to play this with limited time on the clock. Now initially I wanted to play the move bishop takes knight, taking the pawn here, and after bishop e3 I wanted to go rook c4, but after knight d4 you'll notice that the bishop is very loose here. It's difficult to play if I go knight to e7, for example, which I think is one of the options here. After rook to c1, bishop e4, and f3, it feels like I might be losing my bishop here, bishop f5, maybe there's even g4. There's also rook b3 here. It's very, very hard to judge whether this is okay or not, and I don't have 20 minutes to think, so I end up avoiding this line, even though after takes, and bishop b1, black should be okay here. So I go bishop d1 instead, trying to pressure D's knights here, but this move is based on a flawed idea. After Vishy goes knight to e1, here I decide to play bishop e2. You're probably thinking, why not b6? Pin the knight here or win the rook. If white moves the knight, you win the rook and you win the game. But if I go b6, white can take the pawn with the rook, and now my rook on c6 is pinned here. If I take, I lose the tower and I lose the game, and so this b6 idea doesn't work. Additionally, if I take what looks like a free pawn here, now white has bishop e3, creating a classic fossil. He attacks the rook and the bishop at the same time, and I will lose some material. So I go bishop e2 thinking I'm some massive genius here, because now if black plays a move like, let's just say bishop e3, or white plays a move like bishop e3, I have b6 here, and now the pin is in play because the bishop guards his pawn on the backwards diagonal. So if white takes, you take the rook and you win the game. And now if the knight does move, you take this rook, and it's GG as well. So I felt like I was a genius for playing this, but Vishy correctly plays the move rook to e3 here, sidestepping any pins and going after this bishop on e2. Now at this point it's starting to get very scary because this bishop is really getting trapped potentially. If I go bishop g4, there's f3, bishop f5, and g4, and it's uh-oh spaghetti-o time. My b is trapped, and I simply am losing the game in this position. If I go bishop h5, another option here, white can take on b7, but even f3 here, forcing g5 to avoid the trapped bishop is very, very scary after rook b3, and all my pieces are out of play. The rook, the knight, the bishop, and the king have not been developed. I only have the rook and the bishop in the game, and I'm just getting crushed positionally. So in the end, I go bishop takes knight, he takes, and now I go bishop c4, and here we get the move rook c3. Now, at this point, I was not feeling very comfortable about my position. If white were to go b3, you might be thinking, wait, where's the bishop going? It has no squares available. If you go back, there's a4, and uh-oh, spaghetti-o. Bishop is simply trapped, and I lose the game. However, after b3, I can play d4, attacking the rook in between, and after rook e4, bishop d5 takes, and rook c5. White is still probably better, but at the very least, I have a very nice wooden shield in the middle of the board. So, Vishy goes rook c3, I play the move a5 here, creating an escape square for the bishop on a6, and now we get the move b3. Here I go bishop a6, knight f3, and I play this move knight to e7. Now, this move is actually a big mistake. In the game, I initially thought about playing this move rook c8, but I simply thought it was a little bit too slow trying to bring the knight in. But in fact, this would have been best because after white goes knight d4 and knight e7, we'll get something very similar to the game, whereas we're going to see in a second, when I play knight to e7 here, Vishy misses a golden opportunity to get a huge advantage here with this move bishop g5. Now, the reason this move is so strong is that I'm not in time. What I really want optimally is I want this position with the knight on c6 here to attack the pawn on e5 and potentially push d4 as well. If I can get this knight to c6 and blockade this pawn, I'm doing very well in the game. But in this position after bishop g5, you'll notice that the rook is in the way. I can't move the knight to c6 here, and if I play the move that I thought was okay at the start, knight f5, now white goes g4, attacking the horse and intending to put the knight on the square, and after d4, rook c1, bishop to e2, white can go king to g2 here, and after I take and go knight e7, after king to e4, white is simply much better here. He's going to win this pawn on d4. The dark squares around my king are always a big issue, and maybe I can find a way to swindle Vishy, but it's not looking very good for black. This is also why, just to point it out, after rook c8, if white were to go bishop g5 here, h6, I think I actually saw this and was worried about bishop f6, but after takes, castles, and now let's just say knight e5, for example, I have d4, and after rook c2, I can go rook d8 followed by d3 or rook d5, and with this passed d pawn, I'm getting sufficient counterplay. So I go knight e7, and here Vishy plays move bishop d2, and this is simply a mistake from Vishy. So the one other point I want to make is that after bishop g5 and rook c7, if we get this position with the knight on d4, after rook c8 and rook c1 here, I can't push the pawn, the knight is blockading it. White will go f4, maybe a3, b4, and if anybody can win here, it's going to be white. Frankly, I think that if this position occurred in the game, Vishy would have beaten me. Instead, we get bishop d2. Now I'm able to play rook c8 here, and getting the knight to c6 is vital, and now I should not be in all that much danger. We have knight d4, knight c6, takes. I could have taken with the pawn as well, but I thought after rook c1 and a4 takes here, this would be a worse version of the game, because down the road, white is going to put this rook on b6 here and create his own bastion with the pawns guarding the tower. So I take with a rook, Vishy goes rook c1, attacking the pawn, I go a4, he takes, and now I play the move d4. Now the idea here is I want to create this passed pawn. If white were able to get the bishop on d4, by the way, just to illustrate it, white would potentially be better. I guess here there's a b6 idea, but if we forget about the idea and we just think about something like this, for example, white should be much better as I have no counterplay. I can't push f6, I can't push the pawn, the bishop on d4 is simply perfectly placed. So I go d4, Vishy goes rook b1, I decide to castle, we get rook b6, and now I play rook c8. Now, of course, the big difference here is that if the pawn were on c6, the bishop on a6 would be under attack, but here the pawn and the bishop guard each other very nicely, and at this point, I've avoided the worst of the situation. We get rook c6, takes, Vishy goes f3, and now I play the move king f8. Now at this point, you'll notice I am down 2.5+ minutes on the clock here, so I really need to start moving quickly, and luckily this is a position where I have a very simple plan of bringing my king to the center of the board. We get a5, king e8, king f2, king d7, bishop b4, and now I play the move rook c8. Vishy goes rook d1, I push p with d3 here, bishop guarding all the pawns, we get king e3, king e6, and now we have the move a4 being played. Here I go rook to d8. Now it's worth pointing out that the computer actually suggests king d5 here, and after f4, maybe there's a king c4 idea, although frankly, as I look at this position, even if I get the maximum here with king d5, this still is probably going to be a draw, simply as white is blockading the pawn, opposite color b's, and no real way to create anything on the king side here. So instead I play rook d8, Vishy goes f4, I play h5 here, trying to stop white from pushing the pawns, and here he plays the move h4, locking up the king side completely, and at this point it's very clear the game is going to be a draw, even though white has one extra pawn on the queen side, simply because nothing is happening here on the king side. I can't really do anything in the center of the board, opposite color bishops, just not very exciting. So here I go bishop c4, Vishy plays bishop d2, and at this point, Vishy offers me a draw, and I accept his offer. Now, the reason I accept the offer is I could, of course, take the pawn, but after rook to b1 again, there's no way for me to do anything on the b file here. White can always keep checking, and it's just a situation where neither side can make any progress. So I agreed to the draw in this position after bishop to d2. For myself, the result is completely fine, but unfortunately for a second day in a row, we get a big win, or second round in a row, we get a big win, the black pieces, or actually we don't get a big win today. It felt like we had some chances, apologies, because I'm confusing the matches. Felt like we had some chances, but at the end of the day, we lost 2 games, we lose another match. At this point, I would say effectively, we're not going to finish in the top 2 and qualify for the grand final, but for myself, I still want to try and focus. I have games against other top players remaining, so I'll do what I can, but it looks very unlikely that we're going to win this event. But alas, that's how it goes on certain occasions. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the 6th round of the Global Chess League being held here in London. If you're not subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with a recap after I play my 7th round tomorrow, I believe against ALIREZA Fallujah, although I could be mistaken. But I'll be back with a recap, and I'll probably recap Magnus games and everything else. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys very, very soon. Have a good one. Bye.